wealth,
in abundance,
ingenuity,
technology-driven solutions,
energy,
clean, green and renewable,
resilience,
infrastructure,
potential,
enormous opportunities.
As the theme of the annual meeting says, mobilizing private sector finance for climate and green growth in Africa. That tells you that we're beginning to see the importance of the private sector in the development of the continent, because states can no longer do it alone, because the resources are not limitless. And therefore, that partnership with the private sector, and for organizations like ours, engineering the private sector to be involved in the development of our continent, is something we want to emphasize. And that is the whole essence of the theme for this year.
Addressing climate change and promoting a green transition is thus fundamental for Africa's sustainable development. But this will require mobilizing substantial resources. The AfDB annual meetings, which kicked off on Monday, 22nd of May in Egypt's Sharm El Sheikh, with the theme Mobilizing Private Sector Financing for Climate and Green Growth in Africa, promises to be a dynamic and impactful platform for thought-provoking discussions that lead to tangible solutions.
This is the 60th year of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, right? And as some of you will know, on that first day of the 25th of May 1963, one of the resolutions that was adopted was a resolution for the establishment of an African Development Bank. So that resolution is also 60 years. And then the next year in 1964, the African Development Bank was established. So it's significant for us. And one of the highlights of the meeting is a more celebrated Africa Day. Of course, our heads of states will be gathered here to talk about the issues around the international financing architecture, the role of multilateral development banks. Africa is saying we're not being heard enough in terms of our development needs. There are a number of things that Africa is asking for, things that affect Africa globally, and therefore need to pay more attention. How can we reform multilateral development banks to focus on in a manner that is able to deliver what Africa would want, whether it be the World Bank or the African Development Bank, which is even more pertinent for Africa because the African Development Bank understands the needs of the continent and can very well monitor how the continent develops.
The African Development Bank is committed to making growth inclusive by broadening access to economic opportunities for more people, countries, and regions while protecting the most vulnerable. The Secretary General, Professor Vincent, explained how the AfDB ensures grants provided are properly utilized in a way that benefits the most vulnerable.
Money is hardly shared. Rather, member states come to the bank to request for loans. There are poor African countries that benefit from grants under the auspices of the African Development Fund. Right. And those grants are specifically targeted based on the proposals presented by those countries in terms of the needs. And usually, these needs are those that go to address the most vulnerable. For example, during COVID, the bank deployed lots of resources towards helping member countries to deal with the challenges of COVID. And we've seen great results in a number of countries. The ability to be able to establish testing centers, the ability to be able to develop labs and diagnostics that countries were not able to do before. And that has an implied effect on the lives of the ordinary people because most of the time they suffer this more than anybody else. So a lot happens, but we need to understand that the bank, for you to take a loan from the bank has a way of monitoring that the loan is utilized effectively. Definitely we do. I think the coordination is already there. There's what is called under the AU, the Conference of Heads of State on Climate, CAHOSC, right? Which is a coordinated body under the auspices of the AU, working with the Ministers of Environment and other international organizations dealing with the environment, for example, the United Nations Environmental Program. Within the AU platform priority framework, African Union Agenda 2063, there is a coordinated effort on the development of Africa. Now, if you add that to the high fives priorities of the African Development Bank, you get together a blueprint that, working together, systematically implemented, would definitely lead to the development of the country. So those collaborations are there. We work very closely with the African Union to see the relationship between the African Development Bank's high fives and the AU Agenda 2063 to ensure proper development. So that coordination exists.
Day 2 kicked off with an opening ceremony, followed by a high-level presidential dialogue.
Président El Sisi, président de la République arabe d'Égypte, et les invités d'honneur.
The opening ceremony saw high-level personalities, including heads of states, ministers of finance, central bank governors, private sector representatives, academics, and more.
Media houses, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vincent Mehile, Secretary General of the African Development Bank Group, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2023 annual meetings of the Boards of Governors of the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund in this beautiful city of Sharm El Sheikh.
The high-level presidential dialogue, which took place following the opening ceremony, highlighted the need for reforming the global financial architecture and ensuring a transition, one that is more nimble, inclusive, and flexible in responding to the changing nature of global challenges that countries face today.
Africa will need $2.7 trillion to implement the continent's nationally determined contributions by 2030. Yet, the global financial architecture provides only 3% of global climate finance for Africa.
I come to realize the most significant issues constraining Somalia's development and progress is not lack of elaborate planning, but rather the exclusion from global financing.
When you are asking me what is required, what's needed to be done, I think all African countries and all African leaders will know what to do. The issue now is how do we translate all those ideas into actions. And this is what we need to do.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we need inclusive multilateralism with equity and fairness in representation in the Bretton Woods institutions. Achieving the reform of the global financial architecture requires that Africa's voice be strengthened, for example, on the board of the IMF, where the continent has just 2 seats. At the end of the day, the global financial architecture should be more responsive, inclusive, accountable, and re-engineered to support the accelerated development of the world, especially Africa.
Africa has experienced a reoccurrence of climate risks, shocks, and extreme weather conditions.
The 54 countries of Africa have done the least to cause climate change, contributing less than 4% of global emissions. Yet they are suffering some of the worst consequences. The AfDB estimates that Africa loses up to 15% of its potential GDP as a result of climate-related impacts.
Climate change, as we heard in the first opening session, is devastating the economies of Africa. The continent, which accounts for only 3% in terms of historical carbon emissions, suffers disproportionately from the negative effects of climate change. The continent loses $7 to $15 billion annually due to climate change, and the trajectory is that that's probably going to get to $50 billion by 2030.
Addressing climate change and promoting a green transition is fundamental for Africa's sustainable development. But this will require mobilizing substantial resources.
This year of the global stocktake, we need every country and every stakeholder united in solidarity on this issue, alongside mitigation, adaptation, and of course, loss and damage. Addressing climate change is more than a set of numbers. It is more than meeting goals. It is about people who deserve a better future for their families.
We can and probably we must question the ability of the global financial architecture to serve the needs of the world, especially the needs and aspirations of developing countries, especially Africa.
Africa's needs must never be forgotten. Those were the final words from the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. The AfDB Group launched its flagship African Economic Outlook Report for 2023.
The African Development Bank puts great priority on the development of knowledge products to inform policymakers on the performance of the continent, to look at current and emerging global economic, financial, and geopolitical challenges and risks, and how to tackle important issues such as debt, public financial management for sustainable development.
The launch event had two segments, a presentation of the report's highlights and a discussion of its findings.
We saw and reported to you in 2022 the resurgence of growth in tourism-dependent economies, but this is now going down because of the tapering of savings that we have in these tourism source countries. The non-resource intensive economies, which are much more diversified, continues to go forward. So our projection is that such economies will continue to show marked resilience in the coming years.
Low-carbon investments require a tremendous amount of capital that public resources alone cannot cover.
With public financing declining in most African countries, further compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic and economic disruptions due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, public funding against climate change will be insufficient. African countries already spend on average nearly 18% of their tax revenue on debt services, leaving very little room for these countries to finance basic services and the transition to green and inclusive growth.
So when I look at this report, I'm wondering what is the private sector doing? Here is opportunities to make money and deliver global public goods. So you'll be doing well by doing good. So what are we waiting for?
The 2023 report, which shares the same theme as the annual meetings, Mobilizing Private Sector Financing for Climate and Green Growth in Africa, provides a compelling up-to-date evidence and analysis that informs and supports Africa's policy decision-makers, the private sector and the international community.
The public sector cannot do it alone. We need the private sector. But needing the private sector doesn't mean that the public sector should scale down its financing.
Climate finance for developing countries, particularly in Africa, remains low and fragmented. This is a significant impediment to the country's climate ambitions and its transition to a green economy achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Africa Bank is showing the way, particularly on how we tackle the need for far more money. The challenge is to turn billions into trillions.
The report also highlights the important role of Africa's huge natural capital.
Africa has green technology potential. So I'll just give one example. Renewable energy, which we all talk about. The technical potential in renewable energy, 44.8% of that potential is in Africa.
Investment opportunities are emerging for Africa's natural capital, and countries should aim to leverage them.
And we also have low legacy in high emissions infrastructure. So it's easier for us to build these climate resilient green infrastructures that we've been talking about. I want to point out, for want of time, credit to Eastern Africa region. This region was the only region that escaped recession during the COVID-19 pandemic and has continued an upward trajectory in growth, with an estimated 5.1% GDP growth in 2023, and in 2023 that will continue to go higher, even to 5.8. Southern Africa, on the other side, continues to face strong headwinds because of structural issues, energy shortages, and other factors were already discussed in the macroeconomic outlook report launched in January this year. But all the other regions, the central, the western, the northern maintain also positive trajectory in growth. So the resilience of Africa's economies cuts across the regions.
African economies remain resilient, with average growth projected to stabilize at 4.1% in 2023 to 2024.
Looking ahead, we see an acceleration of that growth path, with 4% projected at the end of 2023 and 4.3% projected at the end of 2024. And 5 of Africa's fast-growing economies are set to return to the league of the 10 fastest-growing economies in the world. There is also high and growing political will for climate and green growth in Africa. And COP27, hosted by the Arab Republic of Egypt, was a clear example. This meeting, clear example, heads of states, prime ministers, ministers intervening, and everybody is one voice. Africa needs to act. The world needs to act to support Africa, and global financial institutions need to be reformed to support Africa better.
I'm very glad to be here today to celebrate the Room to Run initiative, which is one of many ways the UK is seeking to support Africa to rise to the challenge of climate-smart development in 2023.
Minister of State for International Development Andrew Mitchell has committed to supporting the delivery of green finance across Africa at the African Development Bank's annual meetings in Egypt.
Room to Run is extremely telling just by the name of the initiative.
Room to Run creates headroom which can be applied to projects all over the continent.
Andrew Mitchell announced that the $2 billion Room to Run guarantee, which the UK had announced at COP26, had now unlocked funding for 2 new climate-resilient water infrastructure projects in Egypt and Senegal.
The UK first committed to the Room to Run guarantee at COP26 in Glasgow. The objective was to use guarantees from the UK government and the City of London insurance market to stretch the African Development Bank's balance sheet and rapidly scale up and speed up the climate finance available to African countries. Here, 18 months later, it's exciting to now be launching the first 2 projects supported by the guarantee in Egypt and in Senegal.
The new projects, namely an €80 million Egyptian wastewater project and the €37 million water sanitation project in Senegal, will offer benefits to millions in their respective countries.
Turning first to Senegal, the Safe Water and Sanitation Services project we're launching today is going, I hope, to be hugely important. The project focuses on the fundamental work vital to keep a population fit and healthy, building standpipes, pumping stations and sewage networks to supply no less than 250,000 households. The project will have an incredible impact on people's health and livelihoods. As I understand it, spades will hit the ground in the next couple of months, and I look forward very much to hearing about progress. The water recycling project the African Development Bank is launching in Egypt is equally exciting. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent impact on grain supplies have demonstrated how fragile food security can be. By improving the quality and availability of water resources, this project will support the foundations of Egypt's economy.
In Senegal, the access to safe water and sanitation services to build sustainable resilience in disadvantaged areas will reach 1.45 million people, of which 51% are women, who will benefit from improved access to drinking water and sanitation.
So you've mentioned possibly moving on to West Africa and other parts of Africa. What are the determining factors in terms of who gets the grant?
Well, Britain has guaranteed up to $2,000 million of projects. Half of them will be in climate adaptation, half of them in climate mitigation. And we saw today the launch of 2 projects which are specifically going to bring clean water and sanitation to people in both Senegal and Egypt. And what this facility, which Britain has procured through the African Development Bank, is able to be spent on all climate mitigation and adaptation projects in Africa that get the approval of the African Development Bank. So it's a truly brilliant collaboration and partnership, and will have real effect and value on the ground in people's lives.
Since the COP in Glasgow, I think a lot of the African countries are saying that the partners are not walking the talk. And I think today the UK is showing that the commitment to provide climate finance is real, and the amount is showing scale, because we're talking about $2 billion.
Many thanks to the UK government. This is an example to be followed by other governments, creating more headroom for MDBs to be able to push important projects in our countries in Africa is extremely timely and extremely relevant and extremely urgent. So thank you very much. Thank you to the African Development Bank, and to Senegal. Congratulations also to the project, and we look forward to working with Senegal as well to showcase many of the good work that our governments are doing together. I always say that we have 3 C's. It's commitment, government commitment on where we want to go. It's clarity with the projects we want to implement, and credibility that we have with all of you partners, both bilateral and multilateral.
The Cabinet Minister outlined the UK's commitment to reforming the international financial system in order to enable delivery of green finance needed to fight extreme poverty and tackle climate change.
In 2015, the world agreed on 17 goals to be reached by 2030. That's the Agenda 2030. 17 of those goals, we think that one that is extremely important is number 17. And you know what number 17 stands for? Partnership. None of the SDGs can be reached by doing it alone. So the coalition of the willing, the partners, the MDBs, I think that's how we're going to achieve the SDGs by 2030.
I think a lot of people in Britain are very proud of Britain's international development work. What they want to see is the money providing really good value, so that they know that their hard-pressed pound is getting 100 pence of value in terms of delivery on the ground. And what you see in the sort of projects we were talking about today is real effect on people's lives, but real effect too on climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So I think all of us are very proud to be involved in such excellent projects.
Reality is that we have a challenge with debt in Africa with many countries. We have 22 countries today that some of them are in terms of either in debt distress, maybe 5 of them, and others at a high risk of debt distress. And the reasons for this are, some of them are exogenous factors. You have global inflation. You have the situation that has happened with the monetary policy in the United States and Europe, where interest rates are now rising, so the cost of servicing the debt has increased. You have global geopolitical risk, in which you have a situation of energy prices rising, commodity prices that are rising, particularly the price of food because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. You have climate change that is driving up, making it very difficult for African countries, losing about 15% of their GDP. So these are just the realities of multiple factors that Africa has to deal with. But the issue on the debt is how we resolve the issue of the debt more generally. And there are 3 ways of doing that. Globally, the world has done well in terms of the debt service suspension initiative, which supported countries not to pay back their debt, service their debt until the situation got improved after COVID-19 situation. Well, that one has ended now. The other one we have now is the G20 common framework, in which the debt owed by the private sector and the debt owed by the public sector of the Paris Club will have to be negotiated, okay? And that is going on. It's a bit of a longer process, but it's very important to have the private sector play a very important role there, and China plays a very important role as also somebody who, a country that holds a lot of debt, giving a lot of loans to Africa. So that conversation continues, but we haven't reached a conclusion on anyone yet, but good progress, it continues to be made. And the last one is on the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights are the only thing we have on the table right now. And the African Development Bank has been leading globally in how we can get the special drawing rights two multilateral development banks like ourselves. We've been working very closely with the IMF on this particular issue. And I'm glad that the financial model that we put together has finally satisfied the IMF in terms of the reserve asset quality of the SDRs. So it basically means that then countries that have SDRs, which are the developed countries, can rechannel some of that back to the African Development Bank. So these are some of the ways in which we're trying to deal with the issue of debt. But I'll say the last thing before I go on the issue of debt. First and foremost is that we must know what's all the debt. No hidden debt. All debt must be on the table. Secondly is that we should not have natural resources being used to back debt because it impoverishes, it makes African countries poorer and in a weaker position to negotiate when it comes to that. And finally is that the debt resolution process must be better coordinated so it doesn't take too long and the transaction costs that it just takes for African countries. You know, there's not really anything bad in debt. If you're taking the right debt, you're taking it at the right level and you can pay back your debt. Thank you.